Loose aggressive opponents are definitely some of the most challenging players you can face when you sit down at the table. Therefore, in today's session, we are going to specifically focus on these opponents, and I'm going to give you 4 exploits that work extremely well against these players. But before doing so, let's jump into how to recognize loose aggressive opponents when you sit down at the table. Loose aggressive opponents, they don't wait around to play only premiums. They are creative players, they are on the lookout for exploits, and lastly, they like to put pressure on their opponents. Now, back in the day when online poker was booming, there were some very memorable, so to speak, loose aggressive players. For example, someone like Dur or Isildur1, these players were well known and capable of putting in bet after bet after bet and putting a ton of aggression on their opponents. Now, I'm not comparing any of us with these type of players, but they are a classic example of someone that plays a loose aggressive style. Let's make it a little bit more practical and look at a HUD stat and a HUD example to recognize loose aggressive opponents. These players, they have a high VPIP and they like to play a lot of flops. They have a high 3-bet frequency. They like to put pressure pre-flop on their opponents. They have a high C-bet frequency post-flop, not only on the flop, but also turns and rivers. They are capable of barreling aggressively. And lastly, they have a high post-flop aggression frequency, meaning these players have a high percentage of streets where they either bet or raise. If I'm going to give you an example, here's, for example, a HUD that I took from my database. You can see that this opponent, he does have a high VPIP of 33. He has a high RFI stat for all different positions. I like to c-bet a lot on the flop c-bet, for example, 71%. He has a high post-flop aggression frequency. And although his 3-bet frequency is not extremely high, it's 7.3 overall, it's still higher than average. Now, I know there are loose aggressive players for sure that play a higher 3-bet strategy, but overall, this is a good example of a player that plays a loose aggressive style. Now, let's jump into the first exploit that I want to share with you for today's session. And that is that I don't want you to sit on their right. And the reason is because if you are the one sitting on the right of a loose aggressive player, this opponent is going to put a ton of aggression on you pre-flop. Let me give you an example here. In this situation, I am sitting in MP. You can see that on my left, I actually have a couple of very tight, passive players sitting there. We got this player in the cutoff who's VPipping 19. He has a very low cold call stat. And the button also has a low VPIP and a low cold call stat. So this is a pretty good situation to sit in. Because if I open raise here, it's not that likely that these players are either going to cold call or 3-bet aggressively. Now let's compare this with another situation. Here I'm sitting in cutoff. And in this situation on my left, there is a player who is VPipping with a much higher frequency. And also his 3-bet stat is much higher. You can see that this player is VPipping 34% of the time, 3-betting 7.2% of the time. And beside him being more aggressive and more capable of entering the pot and putting aggression on me, we also have someone in the big blind here sitting that is quite aggressive. He is 3-betting 16.7% overall. He has a very high VPIP of 82. And therefore, it's very unlikely that in this situation, I'm going to get away with stealing a lot. So if you compare both tables, you can say that in this example here, I'm capable of raising wider than I normally should from MP. Then in this situation, I should raise tighter than I normally would from the cutoff. And the reason is because of table dynamics and because of the fact that here I have 2 loose aggressive opponents sitting on my left here. One actually on the button, so he's actually on my left, and the other one is in the big blind. So I am post-flop in position versus the big blind, but still likely that this player is not going to fold pre-flop. So I have to take into account what is happening here. And I want you to seriously consider, if you sit down at the table and there is no seat available except for the one next right of 1 or 2 loose aggressive opponents, you should seriously consider maybe not taking that seat unless they are maniacs and just putting in like a ton of aggression without doing anything reasonable, of course. But if that is not the case, if there are loose aggressive players that are regulars, Same as the one here on the button. Of course, the big blind here, he's not a regular. He is also a recreational player. But I have to take into account also the button here. And you should seriously consider then maybe not even sitting in that position, because you're going to get pushed into a lot of difficult spots. So always keep in mind table selection and the fact that you don't want to sit next on the right side of a loose aggressive opponent. Now let's continue here with the next exploit, and that is raise first in tight. Now this is extremely important, and the reason is partly what I just spoke about in my first topic. And that is, if you have a loose aggressive opponent sitting on the left of you and you open raise, these players, they will force aggression on you, either by 3-betting or by cold calling more than the average player should, and therefore your fold equity is decreasing. So I want you to keep in mind that whenever you are sitting right of these opponents, that you should seriously tighten up your RFI strategy. You want to enter the pots with stronger hands relatively, and if they 3-bet, you have a stronger range facing that 3-bet. Now, let me give you an example here of what I am specifically talking about. Here we have a cutoff RFI strategy for PLO 50. We see that we can open raise 32.9% in a GTO setting. But we have to take into account that in this PLO 50 rake level, the button is folding more than 80%. And also the blinds are folding quite a lot. Now, if we consider that the button and or the blinds are playing more of a loose aggressive strategy, cold calling more and also 3-betting more aggressively, we have to consider that a lot of the very marginal opens in our position, they will become negative. And that is mainly because they either don't play great post-flop or they don't push any equity versus our opponent's continuing range. Now let me give you some examples of hands that you might want to consider folding next time you sit on the right side of a loose aggressive player. So some of the stealing hands that we have playing from the cutoff here are, for example, these rainbow hands without aces. Now you can see on top here, there are definitely some good hands that we can still open here, like the double paired hands on top. So I can remove the double paired hands here as well. And then scroll down a little bit here and get into the range of hands like King, King, 10, Deuce, Rainbow, for example. Or a hand like King, Queen, Queen, 6. Hands that do have a high pair, but that are completely disconnected, that don't play well against a 3-betting range, even if that 3-betting range is wider than it should. And if you play a multi-way pot, these hands perform also not that great. Now, if you scroll down even more, and I can, for example, get away with all the pairs here from our range, you can see that we are stealing also some of these blocker type of hands because they block 3-betting ranges. You can see that hands like Ace, King, Jack, 4, Rainbow are a potential steal in a GTO setting. But in reality, against loose aggressive opponents, I wouldn't recommend stealing basically any of these hands because you won't take it down pre-flop as often. Now, if we look into another category of hands, for example, single-suited hands here without an ace or without the best high pairs, you can see that, first of all, I will also check out the double-paired hands here. You can see on top there are still a ton of very strong hands in there, of course. But if we scroll down a little bit here and get more into this region of hands that we are open raising, you can see that we are actually raising a lot of hands that have only a tiny fraction of winning EV. For example, a hand like King 4, Jack, Jack, so disconnected single-suited jacks. A hand like King, Jack, 9, 8, single-suited, no pair. A hand like King 10, 7, 6, King 7, 6, 5. Like all these hands, they have like they make like only marginal profit here, and a lot of the profit actually comes from stealing the blinds pre-flop. So I want you to next time, whenever you sit in this situation, seriously consider folding a ton of these hands. Tighten up your RFI strategy a lot, because I see a lot of people, including students of myself, they still open raise the same range as they normally would, but you seriously have to adjust playing against loose, aggressive opponents. Next up, I would like to discuss 4-betting wider. Let's jump into the web app to see what we are talking about here. Here we see a cutoff versus button situation. After open raising and the button 3-bets us, we have a decision to make. We know the button 3-bets 9% here in this GTO model, and we are folding 40%, calling 45%, and 4-betting almost 15% here, sort of. Now, when we think about the situation and know how wide the button is 3-betting us, we know it's 9%, as I mentioned. How would you adjust if your opponent is, for example, 3-betting 12%, or maybe even 13 or 14%? The correct answer here is that there are two things we have to do. First of all, we have to raise tighter, which is what we spoke earlier about. And secondly, we know that we have to 4-bet more aggressively because more hands will push equity against that range. Let's think about this for a little bit more. So let's remove the very best hands from our range, so aces and ace, king, king. We can see that we are left with 6.2% 4-bets. There are still some obvious, very strong hands in there. But let's break it down a little bit further and look into the double-suited kings, for example. Now, in this situation, we can see that double-suited kings are still only 4-betting 29% of the time against a 9% 3-bet. But if your opponent is going to 3-bet much wider, then we can definitely add in more double-suited kings here. Let me show you how you can actually look into this. So I'm gonna go to a different node, which is the small blind versus the big blind situation. And in the big blind versus small blind situation, the big blind actually 3-bets 13% of his range instead of 9. Now let's see what happens with the double-suited kings. You can see that instead of 4-betting 29% of them, we are now 4-betting 46% of them. So many more kings are being capable of now playing more aggressively pre-flop, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, we can also do this for the queens, for example. You can see that in this situation, queens double-suited are 4-betting 32%, almost 33%. And if we go back to this setup, so cutoff versus button, you can see that it is only 24%. So again, there are more queens capable of 4-betting against a wider range. And I want you to jump into these tools and think about this spot yourself. Like, what makes sense here to do? You want to equity 4-bet more. So you want to 4-bet the best strong hands more instead of calling some of them. And I want you to consider what makes sense here. If we would play against an even wider, like almost a maniac player, for example, he is 3-betting 20%. For example, we can 4-bet almost all our kings. I spoke about this in one of the Crushing Small Stakes PLO course episodes. I will put down a link below this video as well, so you can check it out if you want to. But there, kings are 4-betting more than 80% of the time in that situation. And here, if we filter for kings, it's only 17. Now, I'm not saying we should necessarily right away 4-bet more than 80% of kings versus every loose aggressive opponent. But we have to be aware that if he's 3-betting wider than a GTO model, so 3-betting, for example, over 10%, we can add in more kings and also more queens. So keep that in mind next time you play against these opponents. It's a great exploit and something you should definitely have in your arsenal. I think you should seriously study your 4-betting range. I think a lot of people don't do that enough. And you want to be very comfortable with what kings, what queens can you 4-bet versus what ranges, and also how to adjust if your opponent's range becomes wider. My last topic of today is going to be about bluff raising wider. And I think this is an interesting topic because it can feel somewhat uncomfortable because we're playing against an aggressive player. And therefore bluffing seems sort of counterintuitive in a sense, or it seems uncomfortable. But you have to think about it from a logical perspective here. Your opponent is playing more hands pre-flop than he should. Therefore, he will enter the flop with more hands than he should. In addition to that, he's going to c-bet more aggressively than he should. Meaning he's going to add in a lot more bluffs and a lot more marginal hands in his betting strategy, which will give you the opportunity to actually fight back more aggressively against these type of opponents. Loose aggressive opponents are still in a way thinking players. Some of the very best regulars are actually playing this strategy. But they know also that if they bet and face a check raise, they know how to make a fold. And therefore, I want you to keep in mind that if you play against strong, loose, aggressive players, that you should always keep in mind to make sure to add in bluff raises either on the flop or on the turn because their betting ranges are too wide and there is too much air and medium strong stuff integrated in that range. So you can get away with putting in aggression back on these opponents and sort of punishing their wide betting strategy. Now, this is definitely something that feels strange and uncomfortable sometimes, and it's something you should try out for yourself also, because sometimes you have the tendency to sort of lean back more against these opponents, let them do the betting and wait for a strong hand and then let them pay you off completely. But at the same time, you also have to punish these opponents with hands that have good components where you can make strong bluffs, basically. Okay, let's jump into the final takeaway of today's session here. And I would like to discuss these 4 bullet points that we addressed, which is the first one, we don't want to sit on their right. Secondly, we want to raise first in tight versus these players because they will force aggression on you. Number 3, 4-bet wider. If these opponents come in for a 3-bet, the 3-bet range is wider than average, wider than it should be, and therefore you can get away with 4-betting more hands. And lastly, don't forget to still add in some bluff raises here on flops or turns or even rivers because their betting ranges is much wider and therefore there's more air and medium strong hands in there. Okay, thank you all for watching. This was Luke for the PLO Mastermind.